The rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the rusted roof of the small wooden house. Inside, a thin girl sat by the corner of the room, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. She was only 13, her frame delicate, her eyes far too old for her age. Her name was Alina. Her family had grown tired of her, at least, that was the cruel truth she had overheard in hushed arguments, whispered late into the night. They said she was a burden. They said there was no use feeding another mouth when there was barely enough bread to divide among themselves. Her father, a man hardened by failure and drink, had stopped looking at her altogether. Her stepmother, sharp-tongued and merciless, had never considered her blood. To them, Alina was just an inconvenience they longed to cast aside. That evening, the decision was made. Alina sat silently as her stepmother stuffed her few clothes into a ragged bag. "You're old enough to fend for yourself," she hissed, shoving the bundle into the girl's frail hands. "We can't waste our lives on someone who gives nothing back." Her father stood by the doorway, his face turned away, unwilling to meet her eyes. Not a word of defense, not even a farewell. The girl's small voice trembled. "But where will I go?" Her stepmother's lips curled into a cold smile. "Anywhere but here." And then the door shut behind her, with a finality that echoed louder than the storm outside. Alina stood in the rain, clutching the bag to her chest. The night air bit at her skin, and the sound of the storm drowned out the pounding of her heart. The home she had known, no matter how cruel, was no longer hers. She was abandoned, discarded like something worthless. The road stretched before her, muddy and endless, lit only by flickering lamps that looked more like fading stars than sources of hope. She walked. Bare feet splashed through puddles, her bag growing heavy on her shoulder. With every step, her chest ached, not just from the cold, but from the sharp realization that the people who were meant to love her had cast her aside. She was young, but she understood enough. She was truly alone. By midnight, her body trembled with exhaustion. She found shelter under the cracked roof of an old bus stop. Water dripped through holes in the tin, soaking her hair, but she pressed her head against the wall and tried to stay awake. Every sound frightened her: the bark of stray dogs, the shuffle of footsteps somewhere in the dark, the rumble of a distant cart. Her stomach ached with hunger, but worse than that was the gnawing emptiness in her heart. Memories of better days, rare though they were, played in her mind. Her mother's laughter when she was still alive, the way the sun once seemed warmer when she was younger. That warmth was gone now. A single tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it quickly, almost angrily. She whispered into the darkness, as if daring it to listen. "I will survive. You'll see." The words came out shaky, but they burned with something new, something she didn't fully understand yet. It was a spark, fragile but fierce, hidden deep within her. The storm raged on, but Alina's eyes slowly closed. She drifted into a restless sleep on the cold, damp bench, unaware that this night, the night her family abandoned her, was the beginning of a story no one would ever forget. Because the girl left in the rain would not stay small and broken forever. One day, she would rise, and the very people who cast her away would come crawling back to her door. But for now, she was just a trembling child in the storm, with nothing but her will to survive. The storm had slowed to a steady drizzle by dawn, but the cold was merciless. Alina stirred on the hard bench of the bus stop, her body stiff and aching. Her thin dress clung to her skin, soaked from the night before. The streets were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of wooden shutters and the distant cry of crows circling above. She lifted her head, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep, and for the first time she truly felt the weight of her abandonment. She looked down at the bag clutched in her arms. Inside were a few pieces of clothing, threadbare and wrinkled, and nothing more. No food. No money. No token of love from the people who had sent her away. Her stepmother hadn't even packed a blanket. For a moment, Alina wondered if they had expected her to die in the streets. Maybe that had been their plan all along. Rid themselves of a burden by leaving her to the mercy of the world. Her stomach growled, loud enough to make her clutch it in shame, though no one was around to hear. She thought of the bread her stepmother had baked the week before, the smell filling the small house while she was forbidden to touch even a crumb. Hunger had been her companion for years, but this was different. Now there was no possibility of dinner, no scraps from a table, no chance of stealing a potato when no one was looking. Now, hunger was not an inconvenience, it was an enemy. The sun struggled to break through heavy clouds, casting a pale gray light over the town. Alina rose to her feet slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. She looked around and saw shops still shuttered, stalls empty, and streets slick with rainwater. She wrapped her arms around herself for warmth and began to walk again. The town she had grown up in felt like a foreign place. Without the thin thread that had tied her to her home, every corner seemed hostile. She passed by houses where children her age still slept under blankets, mothers cooking breakfast in smoky kitchens, fathers preparing to go to work. Through a cracked window, she caught sight of a little girl with messy hair, her mother combing it gently. The sight stabbed at Alina's chest like a knife. That girl would never know what it meant to be cast away. She forced herself to keep moving. Each step on the uneven cobblestones reminded her how fragile her bare feet were, how exposed she had become. She passed the marketplace, where vendors had begun setting up their carts. The smell of food drifted toward her, fresh bread, roasted corn, steaming dumplings, and her mouth watered painfully. She wanted to reach out to beg, but pride anchored her hands to her sides. She would not beg. Not yet. The day dragged on, the hours stretching like an endless punishment. She searched for corners where she could rest, but each time she was chased away, by a shopkeeper shouting at her to move, by an old woman brandishing a broom, by young boys who threw stones and laughed as she stumbled. Every rejection carved deeper lines into her heart, but with each insult, she whispered the same words under her breath: "I will survive. You'll see." By afternoon, the drizzle returned, soaking her once again. Her thin bag grew heavier with each step until she dropped it near a row of steps leading up to an abandoned building. She sat, curling her knees to her chest, shivering violently. She was so tired. So hungry. She thought about her real mother, the one whose face had grown blurry in her memory. If she had been alive, would this have happened? Or would she have fought for her, shielded her, held her close when the world turned cold? Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. Crying would do nothing. Crying would not bring food or warmth or love. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and tilted her head back, staring at the sky as raindrops landed on her lashes. She was nothing now. No home. No family. No one to call her own. As evening approached, she realized she needed shelter before nightfall. The bus stop had offered little comfort. She wandered the streets until she found an alleyway behind a bakery. The warm scent of bread drifted through the cracks in the wall, torturing her senses, but the narrow space offered cover from the rain. She sat on the ground, resting her back against the damp bricks. Her stomach twisted again, and she pressed her hands tightly against it, as if that could silence the ache. The alley grew darker as the sun disappeared, shadows stretching across the walls. The sounds of the town faded too, vendors closing their stalls, children called home, doors shutting one by one. Soon, she was alone again, the silence of night wrapping around her like a shroud. Her thoughts turned bitter. She thought of her stepmother's face, smug and satisfied as she pushed her out the door. She thought of her father, too cowardly to even look at her as he let it happen. They had chosen their comfort over her existence. They had decided she was unworthy of love. Her chest ached, but beneath the sorrow was something new, a seed of defiance. She whispered into the darkness, the words steady this time. "They will regret it." The night was long. Every rustle of rats, every bark of a stray dog, every gust of wind made her shiver. She hugged her bag to her chest as if it could protect her, her eyes flicking back and forth in the darkness. Fear gnawed at her as much as hunger, but exhaustion finally overpowered both. She drifted into shallow sleep, her dreams filled with cruel faces and endless rain. In her dream she was running, always running, through empty streets, chased by shadows she could never escape. But even in the dream, even in the terror, she carried the spark within her. The first night alone was brutal, but it did not break her. She woke the next morning weaker than before, but still alive. The world had abandoned her, but she had endured. And somewhere deep inside, in a place untouched by rain or hunger, a fire had begun to burn. It was small, fragile, and nearly invisible. But it was there. And in time, it would become unstoppable. Because this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. Morning came with a chill that seeped into Alina's bones. Her body was stiff, her stomach twisted in painful knots, and her lips cracked from the cold. The alleyway that had sheltered her overnight smelled of stale bread and damp earth. She blinked against the thin light creeping through the cracks of the bakery wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, she considered not moving at all, letting the day pass as it pleased. But then the words from last night whispered in her mind, "They will regret it." That thought alone pushed her to her feet. She brushed dirt from her dress and slung the ragged bag over her shoulder. The bag felt heavier today, though there was nothing inside but clothes. Hunger had a way of making everything seem unbearable. She stepped out onto the cobbled street. The town was waking now, vendors unlocking their stalls, sweeping the fronts of their shops, preparing for another day. She walked carefully, trying not to draw attention, though her thin frame and sunken eyes made her stand out. Her bare feet slapped against the wet stone, each step a reminder of her fragility. Her gaze drifted to the bakery windows. Golden loaves sat on wooden shelves inside, their crusts glistening with warmth, steam rising in faint curls. She pressed her hand against her stomach. The hunger was unbearable, a gnawing that clawed at her insides. Her eyes followed a boy about her age carrying a fresh loaf wrapped in paper. He smiled as his mother ruffled his hair. Alina turned away quickly. She wandered aimlessly, her head spinning. The world seemed sharper when you hadn't eaten, a cruel detail she had never noticed before. The cries of vendors were louder, the colors of fruit on display brighter, the smells so overwhelming they felt like torture. She sat on the edge of a stone step near the fountain, watching the bustle of the market. For a long time, she simply sat there, too weak to think, too proud to beg. Then came the voice. "Are you lost?" Alina blinked and looked up. Standing before her was a woman, not young but not yet old, with kind brown eyes and streaks of silver in her hair. She wore a plain shawl and carried a basket of vegetables. Unlike others who had looked at Alina with suspicion or contempt, this woman's gaze held curiosity, concern even. Alina hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't know how to answer. Lost? Yes. Abandoned? Yes. Alone? Yes. But to say it aloud felt impossible. The woman crouched so their eyes met. "You look hungry," she said softly. Something inside Alina cracked. She wanted to deny it, to cling to her pride, but her body betrayed her. Her stomach growled loudly, echoing through the square. The woman's expression softened even more. Without another word, she reached into her basket and pulled out a small loaf of bread, still warm. She broke it in half and held a piece toward Alina. The girl froze. Her mind screamed at her not to take it. She had promised herself she wouldn't beg, wouldn't accept pity. But the smell, the warmth, the ache inside her, it was too much. Her trembling fingers reached out, almost afraid it might vanish before she touched it. When the bread brushed her palm, she clutched it like treasure. "Eat," the woman urged. Alina didn't need to be told twice. She tore into the bread, the crust crunching beneath her teeth, the soft center melting on her tongue. Tears welled in her eyes as she chewed, the taste both heavenly and painful. She had never eaten so quickly, never savored anything so much. For a moment, the world faded, and there was only the bread, the warmth spreading through her empty stomach, the relief flooding her body. When she finished, crumbs clinging to her lips, she whispered, "Thank you." The woman smiled. "What's your name?" "Alina," she said quietly. "Alina," the woman repeated, as if testing the sound. "I'm Mira." She studied the girl for a moment. "Where are your parents?" Alina's throat tightened. She lowered her eyes. "Gone," she muttered. It was easier than explaining. Easier than saying they had cast her out like garbage. Mira nodded, as if she understood more than Alina said. She stood and offered her hand. "Come with me," she said gently. "You need more than bread." Alina hesitated. Trust was dangerous, she had learned that quickly. But Myra's eyes were kind, and the hand she extended was steady. Something about her reminded Alina of her real mother, though the memory was faint now. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her small hand in Myra's. Mira led her through the winding streets, past stalls and shops, to a modest little house at the edge of town. It wasn't large, but it was warm, smoke curling from the chimney, the smell of stew wafting from the open window. Inside, the wooden floor creaked beneath their feet, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and spices gave the room a comforting feel. "Sit," Mira said, gesturing to a chair near the table. Alina sat, her bag clutched to her chest like armor. She watched as Mira ladled stew into a bowl, the rich aroma making her mouth water again. When the bowl was placed before her, she hesitated, unsure if it was truly hers. "Eat," Mira urged again. Alina obeyed. Each spoonful filled her with warmth, driving the cold from her bones. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like an intruder in the world. She felt human again. When she finished, Mira sat across from her. "You don't have to tell me everything now," she said softly. "But know this, you're safe here, at least for tonight." Alina's eyes widened. "You mean, I can stay?" Mira smiled. "For tonight. Tomorrow we'll see. But no child should be alone in the rain." Alina wanted to speak, to thank her, but words failed. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to form sentences. That night, for the first time since being abandoned, Alina slept in a bed, a real bed with a blanket and pillow. The mattress was lumpy, the blanket thin, but to her it felt like heaven. She lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet creaks of Myra's home. Her mind swirled. She still felt abandoned. She still felt broken. But for the first time, she also felt something else, something she hadn't dared to feel since her mother's death. Hope. And though she didn't know it yet, this encounter, this simple act of kindness, would change everything. Because sometimes, all it takes is one helping hand to set a broken soul on the path to greatness. The days that followed at Myra's little home were unlike anything Alina had ever known. For the first time in her life, she woke up without the icy fear of being unwanted. Myra never treated her like a burden. She asked nothing in return for the food and the shelter, only that Alina try her best to help around the house. It wasn't much: sweeping the floor, fetching water from the well, chopping vegetables. Alina threw herself into every task, eager to prove that she wasn't the useless mouth her family had once called her. But Myra's kindness, as warm as it was, could not shield Alina from the world. After a few weeks, Myra explained gently that she could not keep her forever. She was a widow with barely enough to feed herself. "You're strong," she told Alina one evening as they sat by the dim glow of a lantern. "Stronger than you know. You'll make your own way in this world, child. And when you do, you'll see that being cast out was not the end, it was the beginning." The words settled deep in Alina's heart, both terrifying and inspiring. The next morning, with her ragged bag slung over her shoulder again, Alina stepped back into the streets. This time, though, she carried something she hadn't before: the memory of kindness and a fragile belief in herself. The struggle years began then. At first, she took whatever work she could find. She scrubbed floors at the inn until her knees bled. She washed clothes by the river for women who sneered at her but tossed her coins anyway. She sold herbs by the roadside, her hands stained green from crushing leaves. Every job was grueling, every coin too small, but Alina never complained. She swallowed the humiliation, the insults, the exhaustion, because each day she survived was proof that she could. Hunger remained a constant shadow. There were nights she went to sleep with nothing but water in her belly, clutching her bag for comfort. There were mornings she woke to find her body so weak she could barely stand. But each time she was tempted to give up, she remembered the words she had whispered in the rain: "I will survive. You'll see." The town was unforgiving. Children mocked her tattered clothes. Shopkeepers accused her of stealing even when she hadn't. Once, when she dared to ask a baker if she could work for bread, he laughed and told her beggars had no place near his shop. She left with her cheeks burning, her fists clenched, promising herself she would never again beg from anyone. Despite the cruelty, there were small victories that kept her spirit alive. The first time she earned enough to buy herself a pair of shoes, she held them in her hands like jewels. They were second-hand, worn thin at the soles, but when she slipped them on, she felt taller, stronger, less exposed. Another time, a woman she had done laundry for pressed an extra coin into her palm and whispered, "For your honesty." That tiny moment of recognition filled Alina with more pride than she had ever felt in her life. The years blurred together in hard labor and long nights. Alina grew taller, her body lean and wiry from constant work. The timid child abandoned in the rain was fading, replaced by someone sharper, tougher. Her eyes lost their innocence, but they burned with determination. She had learned to endure, to adapt, to fight quietly in ways no one could see. Yet survival was not enough. Deep inside, Alina longed for more. She watched the merchants in the marketplace with fascination. The way they spoke, the way they convinced customers, the way their hands counted coins with practiced ease. She saw how knowledge gave them power, how even the smallest skills could turn into wealth. And she decided that if she was ever to rise, she needed to learn. At night, after her long days of labor, she would sneak into the back of the old library, a crumbling building few cared to visit. The keeper, an elderly man with fading eyesight, barely noticed her presence. She read by candlelight, her fingers tracing over words she stumbled to pronounce. Books became her refuge, her secret weapon. She devoured tales of history, business, science, and poetry, teaching herself slowly but relentlessly. Each page turned was another step away from the girl who had been cast out, and another step toward the woman she was becoming. Still, the road was merciless. There were winters when frost bit her skin until it cracked, when she shivered beneath thin blankets and wondered if she'd survive the season. There were summers when the sun scorched her back as she worked in the fields, her hands blistered and raw. There were days when despair pressed so heavily on her chest that she thought she might collapse under it. But Alina had learned something her family never understood: resilience. They had believed casting her out would break her, that she would vanish into nothing. Instead, every cruelty, every struggle, every humiliation forged her into something stronger. She carried her pain like armor, her hunger like fuel. By the time she was 17, Alina was no longer just a girl scraping for survival. She had carved out a fragile independence. She earned enough to keep a roof over her head in a shared attic room and food to keep her stomach from crying out each night. It wasn't luxury, not even close, but it was hers. Every crust of bread, every coin, every scrap of fabric was earned by her own hands. And yet, she wanted more. She was not content with mere survival. She wanted to build a life so strong, so radiant, that the memory of her family's betrayal would fade beneath the weight of her success. She wanted the world to see her, not as the abandoned girl in the rain, but as someone who had risen from nothing. The struggle years had hardened her, but they had also given her clarity. She knew now that no one would save her, no one would hand her a future. If she wanted a life worth living, she would have to create it herself. And as she stood one evening, looking out at the marketplace where merchants bartered and coins exchanged hands, Alina felt something stir within her. The spark that had been lit the night she was cast out now flared brighter. She didn't yet know how, but she would rise. She would make something of herself. And one day, she swore it, those who had abandoned her would see the woman she had become. The marketplace was alive with its usual chaos. Voices shouting, carts clattering, the smell of spices and sweat weaving together in the heavy air. Alina stood at the edge of the crowd, her small basket of herbs nearly empty. She had sold enough for a modest supper and maybe a candle to read by that night. But as she watched the merchants around her, something stirred inside her, a restless energy she couldn't quiet. She saw a man selling glass trinkets, worthless baubles, fragile and cheap, but people flocked to him. His voice carried across the square, smooth as silk. He didn't just sell trinkets, he sold the idea of beauty, the illusion of owning something rare. She saw another merchant, older and tired, with fine cloth folded neatly on his stall, but his words were flat, his face sour, and customers walked past without a glance. That was when it struck her. Success was not just about what you sold, it was about how you sold it. That evening, back in her small attic room, she couldn't stop thinking. She sat by the window, the city lights flickering below, and whispered to herself, I can do more. I can learn this. The turning point came unexpectedly a few weeks later. Alina had been running errands for a spice seller, carrying sacks heavier than her own body, when she overheard a wealthy merchant berating his assistant. Useless, he spat, shoving a ledger into the boy's chest. You can't even count properly. I need someone who can read, write, and not make a fool of me. The assistant, red-faced, muttered an apology, but the merchant stormed off.
Alina's heart pounded. She could read.
Not perfectly, not quickly, but enough. And she knew she could learn more. Her entire body trembled with the reckless courage of the desperate as she stepped forward.
I can do it, she blurted out.
The merchant turned sharply, eyes narrowing. You. He looked her up and down, taking in her worn dress, the dirt smudging her hands, the shoes that were already falling apart.
He laughed.
A beggar girl who thinks she can handle accounts? Alina met his gaze, her jaw tightening.
I can read. I can write.
And I can work harder than anyone you've ever hired. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then the merchant barked another laugh. Fine, he said, shoving the ledger into her arms.
Prove it.
The numbers swam before her eyes at first, but she steadied her breath, recalling nights spent under flickering candlelight in the library. Slowly, carefully, she added the columns, corrected the mistakes, and handed it back. Her hands shook as she waited. The merchant scanned the page, then grunted.
Humph.
Better than that fool boy.
You'll come tomorrow. Early. Don't be late.
It wasn't kindness. It wasn't charity. It was opportunity. Alina didn't sleep that night, her mind buzzing with possibilities. For the first time, someone had recognized her not as a burden or a beggar, but as someone useful. It was a small door, but it was open, and she was determined to push it wide. The work was grueling, but different from anything she'd done before. She wasn't scrubbing floors or hauling water, she was learning. The merchant was harsh, quick to anger, and never praised her. But he let her stay, and each day she grew sharper. She memorized the weights of spices, the flow of coins, the tricks customers used to haggle. She learned which words made buyers lean in, which gestures closed a deal. She studied not just the trade itself, but the rhythm of commerce, the subtle dance between seller and buyer. For months, she endured insults, long hours and aching exhaustion. But she also began to glimpse something she had never imagined before, the power of knowledge, the power of skill. Each day she worked was another stone laid on the path away from the rain-soaked girl she once was. One evening, when the merchant was away, a wealthy woman entered the shop, searching for rare saffron. No one else was there to help. Alina hesitated, fear gnawing at her. But then she straightened her back and approached. Good evening, she said, her voice calm though her heart thundered. You've come for saffron, yes? This is our finest. She lifted the jar with careful hands, describing its origin, its rarity, its flavor, mimicking the confident tone she'd heard the merchant use.
The woman listened, intrigued.
Alina saw the flicker of interest in her eyes and pressed gently, "You won't find this quality anywhere else in the market." To her astonishment, the woman bought twice the amount she had planned. Coins clinked onto the counter, heavy and gleaming. When the merchant returned and saw the sale recorded in the ledger, his eyebrows rose.
For the first time, he didn't insult her. He simply nodded.
That night, Alina lay in her attic room with the coins still warm in her hand, tears slipping down her cheeks. Not tears of sorrow, but of something fiercer, proof. Proof that she was capable of more than survival. Proof that she could create, achieve, rise. This was her turning point. The moment she realized she didn't have to remain at the bottom, scraping for crumbs. She had a mind, sharp and unyielding. She had fire in her veins. And now she had a glimpse of the road that could lead her out of the shadows forever. She clutched the coins to her chest and whispered into the darkness, "One day, I'll have more than this. One day, I'll have everything they said I never would." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The months passed, and Alina's work at the spice merchant's shop became more than just a job. It was her classroom, her training ground, her battlefield. She woke before dawn, often eating nothing more than a crust of bread before hurrying to open the shutters, sweep the floor, and prepare the jars. By midday, she was serving customers, her eyes sharp, her words carefully chosen. By evening, she was bent over ledgers, counting coins, memorizing figures until her head ached. The merchant remained gruff and distant. He never praised her, never smiled in her direction, but Alina noticed the way he stopped double-checking her calculations. She noticed that when customers asked questions, he let her answer. She noticed that the boy who had once sneered at her for being the ragged girl now kept his distance, no longer daring to mock. These were victories too, small and silent, but they mattered. One day, an opportunity arrived disguised as trouble. It was market day, and the square was crowded with buyers from nearby villages. The spice shop was busier than ever, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and cardamom. The merchant had stepped out to negotiate with a supplier, leaving Alina alone behind the counter. That was when a wealthy nobleman's wife entered the shop, her silk robe swishing as she walked, her fingers glittering with rings. She was the kind of customer Alina feared most, demanding, sharp-tongued, quick to insult. "I want saffron," the woman declared, her voice cutting through the air.
"The finest.
And don't you dare waste my time." Alina swallowed her nerves and brought down the jar of golden threads, her hands steady though her heart raced. "This," she said softly but firmly, "is the purest saffron. The color is rich, the aroma unmistakable. Imported, not grown locally." The woman narrowed her eyes.
"Imported?
From where?" Alina's mind flickered back to nights in the library, poring over maps and trade routes. "From the east," she replied without hesitation. "Through merchants who crossed deserts and mountains to bring it here. Few in this city can claim to sell true saffron of this quality." The noblewoman studied her carefully, as if searching for weakness.
"And how much?"
Alina named a price, higher than she dared. Her stomach clenched, but her eyes didn't flinch.
The noblewoman scoffed. "Ridiculous." She turned, as if to leave. Alina's pulse hammered.
She could let her go, lose the sale, and no one would blame her. But something inside her refused. She stepped forward, her voice steady, "Of course you're free to buy elsewhere. But be cautious, most saffron in this market is colored straw, not true threads. You deserve the finest. And this," she lifted the jar so the light caught the crimson strands, "is the finest."
Silence.
The woman's lips pursed, her eyes lingering on the saffron.
Then, with a flick of her hand, she said, "Fine. I'll take it."
Alina's chest nearly burst as she carefully measured the saffron, wrapped it, and accepted the heavy coins that clinked onto the counter. The woman swept out of the shop without another word, leaving Alina trembling. When the merchant returned and saw the ledger, he stared at the numbers, then at her. For a long moment, his expression was unreadable. Then he muttered, almost grudgingly, "Not bad." For Alina, it was everything. That night, after closing the shop, she held one of the coins from the sale in her hand. It was larger than any she had ever earned on her own. She turned it over in the candlelight, her reflection warped in its surface. It wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that her mind, her courage, and her voice had value. She pressed the coin to her lips, then tucked it into her bag, where she kept the few treasures she owned. It was her first true victory, small compared to the empire she dreamed of, but monumental to the girl who had once slept in alleys with nothing. In the days that followed, something shifted. Customers began to recognize her face, not just the merchants. They asked for her specifically, drawn to the quiet confidence in her tone, the way she explained each spice with care, as if every jar held a story. One afternoon, an old woman approached her stall. She was frail, her shawl patched in many places, and her hands trembled as she held out a few copper coins. "I don't have much," she whispered, "but I need something for my grandson's cough." The merchant would have turned her away. But Alina reached for a jar of thyme and another of honey, measuring carefully. She wrapped them together and placed them in the woman's hands, taking only half the coin she offered. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Bless you, child," she whispered. Alina watched her leave, warmth spreading through her chest. That moment meant more to her than the noblewoman's purchase. Because it reminded her of Mira, the kind stranger who had once given her bread. For the first time, Alina realized she had the power to do the same for others. That night, she whispered into the darkness of her attic room, her voice fierce but soft, "This is just the beginning." And it was. Her first small victory had ignited something inside her. She had tasted what it meant to succeed not just in survival, but in influence. She had learned that courage could turn doubt into opportunity, that words could shape the choices of the powerful, and that kindness could be as strong as coin. The girl abandoned in the rain was no longer merely surviving. She was building. Slowly, carefully, but with a fire that would only grow brighter. She did not yet know the heights she would climb, nor the depths her family would one day fall to. But she knew this, she would never again be powerless. Her first small victory had marked the turning of the tide. And from that night forward, Alina no longer whispered, "I will survive." Now she whispered, "I will rise." The seasons turned, and with each passing year, Alina's life shifted further away from the frightened child who had once been cast into the rain. She was no longer the ragged girl at the edge of the marketplace, begging silently for scraps. She had become something else, someone who understood the rhythm of the market, who carried herself with quiet strength, who knew how to turn even the smallest chance into an opportunity. But the road upward was not smooth. It was long, winding, and filled with obstacles that tested her resolve at every step. By the time she was 18, Alina had learned to bargain like the sharpest merchants in town. She could see when a customer's eyes flickered with hesitation and knew exactly when to press for a higher price or when to pull back. She could hear lies in the pauses between words and could taste greed in the way a hand hovered over a coin. These skills were not written in books but etched into her through years of observation and survival. Still, she remained under the shadow of others. The spice merchant, though grudgingly reliant on her, never offered her more than meager wages. "You're lucky I keep you at all," he often growled, pocketing profits she had earned. And though customers trusted her, the coins that flowed through her hands rarely stayed there. Alina grew restless. She wanted more than wages. She wanted freedom. One evening, after the shop had closed, she lingered by the empty stalls of the marketplace. She looked at the goods left behind, broken baskets, scraps of cloth, discarded jars, and an idea sparked. The next morning, she gathered some of these remnants, cleaned them, patched them, and set up a tiny corner stall of her own. She had nothing fancy, nothing rare, but she had determination. At first, people ignored her. A girl with patched clothes and a handful of scraps did not inspire confidence. But Alina had learned something vital. People didn't just buy goods, they bought stories. She picked up a simple clay jar and told a passing woman, this was made by hands that shaped it with care. It's simple, yes, but sturdy. It will last longer than the painted ones that chip after a week. The woman hesitated, then placed a coin in Alina's hand. It was a small sale, but to Alina, it was monumental. Her own stall. Her own customer. Her own coin. From then on, she devoted every spare moment to her little corner of the market. By day, she still worked at the spice shop, enduring the merchant's scowls. By night, she searched for scraps she could repurpose, cheap goods she could polish into something worth selling. She mended baskets, scrubbed jars, and tied bundles of herbs with rough twine, selling not perfection but honesty. The work was brutal. There were days she slept only a few hours, her hands blistered, her back aching. There were weeks when she sold nothing, when she stood in the cold wind while richer merchants sneered at her pitiful display. But she refused to quit. Each failure was another lesson, each insult another spark to her fire. Her persistence began to pay off. People noticed her honesty, the way she never cheated, the way her eyes shone with determination. That girl, they whispered, she works harder than anyone. Word spread slowly but surely. More customers came. More coins clinked into her pouch. But with success came envy. Other stallholders mocked her, claiming she undercut their prices. Some tried to chase her away from the corner she had claimed. One evening, She returned to find her small table overturned, her goods scattered into the mud. For a moment, despair nearly swallowed her. But then she remembered the first night in the rain, the hunger that had gnawed at her belly, the voices of her stepmother and father saying she was worthless. She clenched her fists and set her table back upright. She cleaned the mud from her goods, lifted her chin, and returned the next day as if nothing had happened. Her resilience only drew more respect. Customers saw her standing there, day after day, no matter the weather, no matter the obstacles. And they admired her for it. By 19, Alina's little stall had grown. She no longer sold scraps alone. She had learned how to buy herbs in bulk and dry them herself, how to mix them into remedies for coughs and fevers, how to package them neatly with scraps of cloth she stitched together at night. She had also discovered something else. People trusted her advice. Mothers came to her for remedies for their children. Laborers asked her what to use for aching joints. She spoke with care, always humble, always honest, and her words carried weight. One evening Mira, the woman who had once given her bread, appeared at her stall. Her hair was grayer now, her step slower, but her eyes were still kind. She looked at Alina's table, at the bundles of herbs, the jars, the small stack of coins. Then she looked at Alina herself. "You've built something," Mira said softly, pride in her voice.
Alina's throat tightened.
She wanted to fall into the woman's arms, to thank her again for that first act of kindness. Instead, she simply nodded, whispering, "It's only the beginning." But even as her life began to climb upward, shadows still lingered. There were nights when she counted her coins and realized they were not enough. Times when sickness spread through the town and her remedies were in such demand she couldn't keep up, leaving her exhausted and overwhelmed. Times when wealthier merchants spread lies about her, calling her a fraud, trying to crush the reputation she had fought so hard to build. Each challenge cut deep, but Alina no longer broke. She had become iron bent and hammered by the hardships of her struggle years, but forged into something unyielding. The long road up was far from easy. It demanded sacrifice, endless toil, and nights of doubt that clawed at her mind. But with every step, she rose higher. With every obstacle, she grew stronger. And though she could not yet see it, each coin she earned, each customer who trusted her, each rival who envied her was another brick laid in the foundation of something greater than she had ever imagined. The girl abandoned in the rain was becoming a woman with a future. And the world, cruel, unforgiving, merciless, was finally beginning to take notice. The marketplace pulsed with life as it always did. Merchants calling out their wares, the smell of roasting meat drifting through the air, children weaving between stalls with sticky fingers and mischievous grins. But on this particular day, something was different. Alina didn't know it yet, but fate had chosen this day to tip the scales in her favor. She was 19, nearly 20, and her small herb stall had grown into something respectable. No longer a few scraps on a wooden table, her goods were neatly arranged bundles of dried herbs, jars of salves, small cloth packets of teas she had mixed herself. She had taught herself to write labels carefully, each one marked with the herb's name and its use. People now sought her out not because she was cheapest, but because they trusted her knowledge. Still, she lived on the edge of survival. The profits she earned barely kept her attic room paid, and often she still went to bed with hunger gnawing at her stomach. But that morning, she woke with the same determination as always, to sell, to survive, to keep rising. The sun climbed higher, and the square grew more crowded. Alina adjusted her jars, brushed dust from her table, and forced a smile onto her lips. She had learned long ago that appearance mattered. Confidence drew customers as much as the goods themselves. It was then that a carriage rolled into the marketplace, its polished wood gleaming, horses snorting as they pulled it to a halt. The crowd parted, whispers rippling through the air. From the carriage stepped a man richly dressed, his cloak trimmed with fur, his rings glittering on his fingers. He was followed by attendants carrying baskets and chests, clearly on a buying trip.
Alina's breath caught.
This was no ordinary customer. This was a man of wealth and influence, someone whose coin could change her life. She lowered her gaze, trying to calm the sudden storm in her chest. Wealthy customers rarely stopped at stalls like hers. They went to the established merchants, the ones with large shops and banners flying overhead. And indeed, the man moved first toward the spice seller, who bowed deeply and hurried to show him his finest goods. Alina forced herself to focus on her own work, though her heart pounded. She adjusted her bundles again, lined up her jars with trembling hands. And then, as if fate had drawn his eye, the man turned. "What is this?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the square. He pointed to her stall. The spice seller's smile faltered. "Just a girl with weeds," he said dismissively. "Nothing of worth." But the wealthy man ignored him and strode toward Alina. She stood straighter, her hands gripping the edge of her table to keep them from shaking. "These are not weeds, sir," she said softly but firmly. "These are remedies."
The man's sharp eyes studied her, then dropped to the jars. Remedies. Alina lifted one jar with steady hands.
"This salve eases pain in the joints," she explained, her voice clear though her pulse raced. "It is made of comfrey root and willow bark. Farmers use it after long days in the fields. It works faster than any tincture you'll find in the apothecary." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued.
"And this?"
He gestured toward a packet of dried leaves. "Chamomile," Alina said without hesitation. "Boiled into tea, it calms the nerves and soothes restless sleep. Mothers give it to crying children. Soldiers drink it when their minds are troubled." The man's lips curled into a faint smile.
"You speak with certainty."
"Do you make these yourself?"
"Yes," she answered.
Her voice wavered only slightly. "Every bundle, every jar. I gather the herbs, dry them, mix them, and prepare them with my own hands." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. The wealthy man studied her for another long moment, then picked up the salve and the chamomile. "I'll take these," he said, placing several heavy coins on the table.
Alina froze.
The weight of the money stunned her. It was more than she usually earned in a week. She forced herself to nod, wrapping the goods carefully in cloth and handing them to his attendant. But then, something unexpected happened. The man leaned closer. "You have talent, girl," he said quietly. "And courage to speak as you did. I will remember your name."
"Alina, yes." Her heart thudded. "Yes, sir."
He gave a single nod, then turned and left, his carriage disappearing into the busy streets. The marketplace buzzed with whispers after he was gone. Merchants eyed her with thinly veiled envy. Customers approached, curious now, emboldened by the nobleman's approval. Her stall, once overlooked, was suddenly surrounded. People bought her teas, her salves, her bundles of herbs, as if they too wanted a piece of what the nobleman had touched. By sunset, her table was nearly bare. Coins filled her pouch, heavy and clinking with a sound that made her chest ache with joy. She had never held so much in her life. That night, back in her attic room, she spilled the coins onto her bed. They gleamed in the flickering candlelight, small circles of promise. Her hands shook as she touched them, her throat tight with emotion. This was more than money. This was proof that the world had noticed her. She closed her eyes, her mind replaying the nobleman's words, "You have talent. I will remember your name." It was her big break. The moment her years of struggle, hunger, and humiliation began to tip into something greater. The turning point had given her direction, but this moment gave her wings. As she lay down to sleep, the coins tucked safely beside her, Alina whispered to herself, not in desperation this time, but in conviction. "This is only the beginning. One day, the world will know my name." And outside her small window, the city stretched endlessly, waiting for the girl who had once been abandoned in the rain to rise and claim it. The nobleman's visit had changed everything. In the days that followed, Alina's little stall became a destination rather than an afterthought. People whispered of the wealthy man who had chosen her herbs over the wares of established merchants. Curiosity brought them at first, then trust, and finally loyalty. One sale became 2, then 10, then dozens. Her once empty table was now stripped bare before noon, and she found herself working late into the night to prepare more jars, more bundles, more teas. But it wasn't just the sudden surge of customers that transformed her life, it was the way Alina herself began to change. She was no longer the girl who lowered her gaze in the marketplace, waiting to be dismissed. She stood taller now, her shoulders squared, her voice steady. When she spoke of her remedies, people listened, not because she begged them to, but because her words carried weight, shaped by knowledge and conviction. Her hands, once calloused from scrubbing floors, now moved with confidence as she mixed herbs and tied bundles, each motion deliberate, each gesture filled with purpose. With the coins she earned, she made careful choices. She did not waste them on finery or indulgence. Instead, she bought sturdier tables, glass jars to protect her herbs, clean cloth for packaging. She invested in herself. Slowly, her stall transformed from a corner of scraps into something that looked professional, almost elegant, catching the eyes of those who once overlooked her. And still, she studied. By candlelight, she pored over books in the library, learning about plants, trade routes, even basic mathematics. She taught herself not just how to mix remedies but how to think like a merchant. She studied profit and loss, supply and demand, and she began to see patterns, when herbs were scarce, when they were plentiful, when to buy and when to sell. Her mind grew sharper, her vision clearer. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. By the time she was 21, Alina had saved enough to rent a small shop at the edge of the marketplace. It was nothing grand, a single room with shelves she built herself, a counter worn smooth by her hands, but it was hers. She painted her name on a wooden sign above the door, Alina's Remedies. For the first time, her name wasn't just whispered in the streets, it was written, carved into wood impossible to erase.
People came in droves.
Farmers brought their wives for teas to soothe childbirth pains. Laborers sought her ointments for their aching backs. Wealthy women bought her chamomile and lavender, not just for healing but for comfort. She greeted each with the same calm determination, treating the poorest and richest alike, never cheating, never lying. Her honesty became her reputation, and her reputation became her wealth. But wealth is never free of enemies. The older merchants, those who had once mocked her, now eyed her with suspicion and resentment. They whispered that she was a fraud, that she used tricks, that she had bewitched customers with her pretty words. Some tried to spread lies, others lowered their prices to drive her out. Once, her shop was vandalized, her jars smashed, her shelves overturned. For a moment, the fear of losing everything she had built nearly crushed her. But Alina did not break. She swept up the shards, replaced the shelves, and opened her doors again the very next morning. Her customers returned, their loyalty unshaken. They knew her truth, and they stood by her. And so she rose. By 23, Alina had expanded beyond the little shop. She hired helpers, other abandoned children, girls who had once stood in the rain as she had. She gave them food, shelter and work, teaching them as Mira had once taught her. Her small enterprise grew into something larger, a network of stalls and shops in neighboring towns. Coins flowed like never before, heavy bags of silver and even gold finding their way into her hands. But the greatest transformation was not in her wealth, nor in her shop, but in herself. The timid child was gone. In her place stood a woman of strength, her presence commanding, her words carrying authority. She dressed simply but with dignity, no longer in rags but in clean sturdy fabrics that spoke of quiet success. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now burned with purpose. She no longer whispered "I will survive" or even "I will rise."
She lived it. She embodied it.
People in the city began to speak her name with respect. Some called her the herb mistress. Others called her the girl who rose from nothing. Children whispered her story, mothers pointed her out as an example, and even men of wealth and influence acknowledged her. And yet, despite everything she had achieved, Alina never forgot the girl she once was. She never forgot the hunger, the rain, the cruelty. That memory was etched into her like a scar, one she wore proudly, because it reminded her that nothing had been given to her. Everything she had earned. On quiet nights, she would sit by the window of her modest but comfortable home, looking out over the city lights, remembering Myra's words. This is not the end, it is the beginning. Mira had been right. The abandonment had not ended her, it had forged her. But life has a way of circling back. For even as Alina transformed into a woman of power and success, somewhere beyond her new world her old family, the ones who had cast her into the rain, were beginning their own decline. Debt, greed, and misfortune clawed at them. And though Alina did not yet know it, their path and hers would cross again. And when it did, they would not find the weak, trembling girl they had abandoned. They would find a woman transformed, wealthy, powerful, and unrecognizable. The reckoning was coming. While Alina's world was rising, far beyond her sight, the people who had once cast her out were unraveling. Her father and stepmother had remained in the same small wooden house, the same place where they had closed the door on her during that stormy night. For years, they had lived as if their decision had erased her from existence. To them, Alina was gone, discarded, forgotten, a burden lifted from their shoulders. But the past has a way of clawing back, and the choices they had made began to poison their lives. Her father, once strong enough to earn wages as a laborer, had allowed the bottle to claim him. Drink dulled his days, anger filled his nights. He squandered what little coin he earned, leaving debts unpaid and tempers rising among neighbors. The respect he once carried for his hard work vanished, replaced with scorn. His hands, once steady with tools, grew shaky, and soon no one trusted him with work at all. Her stepmother, bitter and sharp-tongued, grew meaner as their fortunes dwindled. She lashed out at anyone who came near, convinced the world had conspired against her. The neighbors whispered that her cruelty had cursed the family, that no good could come to a household built on such coldness. They had other children, half-siblings to Alina, and for a while those children eased the burden. But greed poisoned even that bond. The eldest son grew tired of feeding a family that had no gratitude and left the house entirely, vanishing to find his own way. A daughter was married off hastily, but her husband was poor and cruel, and soon she stopped visiting altogether. One by one, their circle shrank, until only the father and stepmother remained, trapped in the home that seemed to rot from within. The walls cracked, the roof leaked, and the air reeked of despair.
Money was scarce.
What little food they managed to gather was never enough. The stepmother sold trinkets, old clothes, anything she could tear from the house, but even those small sales dried up. Neighbors who had once tolerated them now crossed the street to avoid them, unwilling to lend a hand. Their pride had turned to poison, and now no one came near. Rumors of Alina's name began to reach even their ears. At first, they scoffed when they heard whispers of a woman in the city who sold herbs and remedies, who had built a name for herself from nothing.
"It's not her," the stepmother said sharply. "It can't be.
She would have died in the streets. That's what happens to children like her." But the stories grew louder, richer. People spoke of shops, of wealth, of a girl who had been abandoned and yet had risen.
And deep down, the stepmother knew.
The father too, though he drowned the thought in drink. The truth haunted them, but they never spoke it aloud. Years passed, and their fortunes only grew worse. The father fell ill from his drinking, coughing blood into rags, too weak to rise from his bed. The stepmother, once fierce and proud, found herself begging scraps from neighbors she had once mocked. Her sharp tongue had no bite left, only desperation. They lived in shadows now, forgotten by the town, despised by those who remembered their cruelty. Hunger gnawed at them, cold seeped into their bones, and the house that had once sheltered them now felt like a prison. One winter evening, as the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, the stepmother stared at her husband lying pale and wasted on the bed. Her mind turned, bitter and sharp, to the daughter they had cast away.
Alina.
The name burned like a wound. "She lives," she muttered, her voice shaking with fury and envy. "She thrives while we suffer."
Her husband groaned, too weak to respond.
The stepmother clenched her fists. She hated the thought of begging Alina. But hate did not fill an empty stomach. Hate did not mend broken walls. And as the cold bit into her skin, as her husband coughed again, she knew the truth. They had nothing left. Nothing, except the daughter they had abandoned. It was a bitter irony, crueler than she could have imagined. The girl they had discarded had become their only hope. And so, whispers began to stir. The stepmother asked questions, tracing rumors through the town. Where was this Alina? Where could she be found? At first, people refused to answer, unwilling to help a woman known for her cruelty. But desperation makes persistence relentless, and eventually, she learned enough. Alina's name was written on the lips of merchants, her shop known throughout the city. The stepmother's heart twisted with shame and fury. She had cast the girl aside as worthless, and now that same girl lived in comfort, in wealth, in dignity. Her pride screamed at her to turn away, to die in her squalor before bowing to the child she had despised. But hunger silenced pride. Fear of death silenced hate. And so, with her husband too weak to walk, she made the choice.
They would go to her.
They would stand at the door of the girl they had abandoned. They would beg. They told themselves it was survival, that they had no other choice. But beneath it all, shame festered. They knew what they had done. They knew what they deserved. And they knew, though they would never say it aloud, that if Alina chose to turn her back on them, it would only be justice. The morning was quiet when the knock came. Alina sat in her shop, the golden light of dawn filtering through the window, glinting against the rows of jars she had so carefully arranged. The shelves behind her were lined with bundles of herbs, neatly labeled, the culmination of years of sweat, hunger, and unbroken will. She was 25 now, no longer the girl who had shivered in the rain. She carried herself with a grace born from hardship, her voice steady, her hands strong. Customers came not just for remedies but for trust, and her name had become one spoken with respect across the city. The knock was hesitant, almost timid. Not the firm knock of a customer eager for trade, nor the hurried rap of a messenger. It was weak, uncertain, like someone unsure if they even deserved to be there. Alina frowned and rose from her stool. She crossed the floor, her steps measured, and opened the door. Two figures stood on the threshold.
Her breath caught.
Her stepmother, aged beyond her years, hunched and hollow-eyed, her once sharp features now etched with lines of bitterness and despair. Her clothes were ragged, her shawl threadbare, her lips cracked from cold. Beside her slumped her father, gaunt and frail, leaning heavily on a crooked stick. His eyes, once stern and unyielding, were clouded with sickness and shame. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Memories came crashing back, the night they had thrust her into the storm, the cruel words, the slammed door. She remembered the hunger, the fear, the loneliness. The child they had abandoned was alive within her still, and she stared at them now, her chest tightening with emotions she had thought buried. The stepmother's lips trembled.
"Alina," she whispered, her voice hoarse.
Hearing her name from that mouth was almost unbearable. "We," her stepmother faltered, her eyes darting to the floor. "We need your help." Alina's grip tightened on the doorframe. The audacity of it, the gall of standing there begging after all they had done, made her blood burn. For years she had dreamed of this moment, imagined it in countless forms. Sometimes she pictured herself slamming the door in their faces. Sometimes she imagined laughing, telling them they had reaped what they had sown. But reality was heavier. It pressed on her chest, tangled with anger, grief, and something she did not want to name, pity. Her father tried to speak, his voice a rasp. "We have nothing left." He coughed violently, bending over, his thin frame shaking. The stepmother steadied him, then looked up at Alina with eyes that once held only cruelty but now brimmed with desperation. "We are hungry," she whispered. "We are sick. We have no one else." Silence stretched between them. The marketplace hummed faintly behind Alina, but here at her door, it felt like another world entirely. She studied them carefully. They looked smaller than she remembered, weaker. The mighty tyrants of her childhood had been reduced to shadows. She had risen, and they had fallen. Life had drawn its own justice without her lifting a hand. Part of her wanted to savor it. To remind them of every insult, every night she had starved while they feasted, every cruel laugh as they shoved her aside. She wanted to spit their words back at them. "You're old enough to fend for yourself. Anywhere but here." Instead, she spoke quietly, her voice steady as stone. "Do you remember the night you cast me out?" The stepmother flinched, her face paling. "Alina." "You shut the door on me," Alina continued, her eyes burning. "You told me I was a burden. You left me in the rain to die. And now you stand here, asking me to save you." Her father's head bowed, shame etched deep in his features. Her stepmother's lips quivered, but no words came. Alina's chest heaved. Rage roared inside her, but so did something else, a cold, cutting clarity. She had imagined this moment for years, and now that it was here, it was not sweet. It was heavy, tangled with sorrow. She could turn them away. She could let them starve, let them rot in the very misery they had created. It would be justice. No one would fault her. But she was not them. She was not the cruel stepmother who shoved a child into the storm. She was not the father who looked away. She was Alina, the girl who had survived the rain, who had built herself from nothing, who had risen. She exhaled slowly, then stepped aside. "Come in," she said flatly. Shock flickered across their faces. They shuffled inside, moving like ghosts, their eyes darting nervously around the clean shelves, the jars, the life she had built without them. They looked so out of place in her world, ragged and broken, while she stood tall in her own domain. She fetched bread and broth, setting it on the table. They ate greedily, their frail hands trembling as they lifted spoonfuls to their lips. Alina watched in silence, her heart a storm. When they were finished, her stepmother wiped her mouth with a shaking hand. "Thank you," she murmured, unable to meet Alina's eyes. Alina stood, her hands pressed against the table. "This does not erase what you did," she said, her voice firm. "Do not mistake my kindness for forgiveness. You abandoned me. You left me to starve. That will never be undone." Her stepmother lowered her head. Her father coughed again, too weak to respond. Alina's gaze softened slightly, but only slightly. "You may eat here tonight. Tomorrow, I will decide what to do with you." And with that she turned away, leaving them to the silence of the shop. Her chest ached as she climbed the stairs to her room. This was the moment she had dreamed of for so long, and yet there was no triumph in it, only the weight of choices, of scars, of the endless question, what kind of person would she be now? The reckoning had come. The reunion was here. And tomorrow, she would choose whether to break the cycle of cruelty, or to let it consume them all. The morning light crept slowly across Alina's room, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. She had not slept. The night had been a storm of memories, her stepmother's sneer as she was pushed into the rain, her father's silence, the gnawing hunger of her first nights alone. And then, the faces she had seen yesterday, broken, frail, desperate. The same people who had once been her tormentors now reduced to beggars at her door. She sat at her table, staring at the small pouch of coins she had left there. Each coin glinted with the reflection of her journey, from scraps and survival to respect and wealth. Every step had been her own, carved out of pain and perseverance. They had given her nothing. And yet here they were, asking for everything. When she finally descended the stairs, she found them still seated in the shop. Her father slumped in the chair, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Her stepmother sat stiffly, her hands twisted in her lap, eyes darting nervously as if afraid of what Alina might say. Alina stood before them, her presence commanding, her silence heavy. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, But now that it was here, the words came slowly, carved from the deepest parts of her. You threw me away, she began, her voice steady but cold. You decided I was worthless. You left me to starve while you shut the door on my face. Her stepmother flinched but did not speak. You thought I would die, Alina continued. And perhaps that's what you wanted. But I didn't die. I lived. I suffered, yes, but I rose. Every coin I earned, every jar on these shelves, every word spoken in respect of my name, it was mine. Not yours. Mine. She stepped closer, her eyes burning. And now you come here, asking for my help, as if the years of cruelty can be washed away by hunger. As if you deserve mercy. Her stepmother's lips trembled. We were desperate, she whispered. We thought it was the only way. Alina's jaw tightened. And what about me? I was a child. Was my desperation worth nothing to you? Her father let out a hoarse cough, his voice barely audible. We were wrong, he rasped. I was weak. I failed you. His eyes, clouded with sickness, glistened faintly. I see it now. But it is too late to undo. The room was silent, but for his labored breaths. Alina's chest tightened. The child inside her still screamed for justice, for revenge, for the satisfaction of turning them away as they had once done to her. She could feel that dark temptation curling at the edges of her heart, urging her to slam the door, to leave them to rot. But another voice whispered, quieter yet stronger. The voice of Mira, the woman who had once given her bread when she was starving, who had shown her kindness when she had nothing. If Mira had turned her away that day, Alina would not be here now. She inhaled slowly. You will not live here, she said finally, her tone sharp. Her stepmother's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. But Alina raised a hand. Do not mistake me. I will not abandon you as you abandoned me. I will arrange food. I will arrange a roof. But it will not be under my roof. You will not walk through my life as if nothing happened. My kindness is not your redemption. It is mine. Her stepmother bowed her head, shame flooding her features. Her father nodded weakly, tears slipping from the corners of his eyes. Alina straightened, her voice ringing with finality. You will live, but you will live with the knowledge that your survival came from the daughter you cast into the storm. That is your punishment, and my justice. With that she turned, leaving them to sit in silence. Later that day, she sent word through her helpers. Food was delivered, shelter arranged in a modest dwelling on the edge of the town. It was not comfort, but it was survival. Enough for them to live, to eat, to breathe. As the days passed, Alina continued her life, her shops expanding, her name spreading further. She rarely saw them again, but she knew they lived, dependent on the kindness of the girl they had once despised. And in quiet moments, when she stood at the window of her home, looking out at the city she had conquered, she felt no triumph, no gloating. What she felt was deeper, sharper, a sense of peace. She had chosen not to be them. She had broken the cycle of cruelty. Her vengeance was not in their suffering. It was in her success, her power, her refusal to let their cruelty define her soul. One evening, as the lamps flickered in her shop and the night wrapped the city in silence, she whispered to herself the words she had once spoken in the rain, the words that had carried her through hunger, loneliness, and pain. I survived. And I rose. And now, the whole world knew it.